Three men with swords stand over a body in the snow. They think they've found a corpse. But the corpse opens its eyes and, first thing, analyzes down to the last detail why their blades broke. Overheating during forging, hardening without tempering. Page 142 of a textbook that will never be written in this world. The cold burns his face. Snow fills his mouth. Dan opens his eyes and sees a gray sky like a concrete slab. He sits up. His arms are intact. His legs are intact. Not a scratch. And the last thing he remembers is the light of a truck's headlights and the sound of the impact. He must be dead. But he's here. Standing over him is a red-haired Hulk nearly 6 feet tall, holding a shard of a sword in his hand. The Hulk says something in a foreign language, and Dan understands every word. It's impossible. The sounds are foreign, but the meaning sinks in so smoothly, as if he's heard this language his whole life. The giant asks if he's alive, where he's from. He says there isn't a single village within 30 miles, but Dan doesn't hear the questions. He stares intently at the sword fragment, and everything else ceases to exist. Coarse grain along the entire fracture line, overheating during forging, hardening without tempering. Classic. Dan spent 10 years examining fractures like this at the plant, and every time it meant the same thing. Someone was lazy. Someone decided it would do. He says this out loud. He says the blacksmith overheated the steel, that the blade should have snapped much earlier. The big guy blinks slowly. The other two exchange glances. The big guy asks how he knows, and there's no wariness in his voice anymore. There's something else there. Dan exhales a puff of steam. He'll cry later. There's work to be done now. He asks to be taken to the blacksmith. The big guy is silent for 5 seconds. Then he nods. He says his name is Brand, senior scout of the Gray Steel Guild. They patrol the northern border and found Dan by chance. Another couple of hours, and he would have frozen to death. Brand tosses him a rough woolen cloak. Dan wraps himself in it and follows. The snow is knee-deep. The wind cuts into his face. He doesn't ask where they're going. Everything can wait. Now he looks at the shard on Brand's belt and thinks. Someone in this world made steel with a grain size of 0.5 millimeter and called it a weapon. They walk for 4 hours. Dan is silent, studying their blades. The sinewy scout sword is shorter than standard, and the hilt is wrapped in 3 layers of leather. That means the balance is off, and the owner is hiding it. The broad-shouldered man with the scar is bent at the tip, a deformation from a blow that hasn't been straightened out. Both are made of the same shoddy iron. Dan can tell by the color, by the pitting along the blade, and he remains silent. By evening, a fortress comes into view. Ironhold. Walls 3 men high, a tower with a gray banner, a hammer on a black field. The gates are lined with rusty iron. The hinges are loose. Dan looks at the gate and thinks the hinges need replacing. People don't live inside. They're just hanging on. A stable with 10 stalls, but only 3 horses. Barracks for 300 fighters, but in the courtyard there are 24 old men over 40. There are almost no young people. Brand leads him to the smithy. The smell of coal hits Dan 20 paces away, and this smell hits him harder than the snow and a foreign sky. He had lived in this smell for 10 years. Burnt coal, scale, heated metal. That was his world. It's hot and dark inside. A furnace, an anvil, a hardening vat, and an old man by the fire. One-eyed, hands like tree roots. Brand calls him Halgrim, the guild's senior blacksmith. Halgrim lifts his head, looks at Dan with his one eye, says nothing, returns to his work. And Dan immediately spots the mistake. The horn is overheated. The strip is already burnt at the edges. Halgrim doesn't notice because he doesn't know what to look for. He hammers the way his father taught him, and his father learned from his grandfather. 4 generations of the same mistakes passed down like a relic. Dan says nothing. It's not his forge. Not yet. Brand leads into the tower, a stone room, a straw mattress. In the morning, they'll take him to the master. Dan is left alone, in a foreign world, without money, without a single familiar face. He has only what's in his head: hardening temperatures, tempering regimes, charge compositions. Back home, it was just a regular job. Here, it could be anything. The morning begins with a bang on the door. The master is waiting. The hall is large and cold. A man sits at the far end, thin, upright, gray hair and a crew cut, and a cough. A hollow, hacking cough that Dan recognizes instantly. Silicosis, late stage. This man is breathing with only a quarter of his lungs. Master Garrett Vaughn, head of the guild. He stares at Dan in silence for a long time. Then he says that Brand told him about the broken sword, about the stranger who identified the cause with a single glance. He asks who he is. Dan thinks for 3 seconds. Then he tells the truth. Not all of it. Enough. He says he's a master metalworker from a distant land, that he can forge blades that bend but don't break, pikes that pierce cuirasses, that he needs a forge and time. Vaughn coughs. He listens. Then he hits him with a single question. Why is Dan offering this to him instead of going to Castlelot, where they pay in gold for such work? Dan answers. Castlelot didn't pick him up in the snow. Vaughn is silent. He nods. He says he has no money to pay. There's a corner in the tower, a bowl of soup, and a promise. If Dan does what he says, the guild will owe him as much as he himself names. They don't shake hands. Brand leads Dan back to the forge. Halgrim hears that the master has given the stranger access to the forge. He is silent for 10 seconds. Then he utters a single word. Fine. And there is so much cold in that word that Dan feels it on his skin. This isn't an invitation. It's permission. Dan doesn't go near the fire. For the first 2 hours, he watches. An old, damp furnace, cracked clay walls, a hand-operated bellows. He picks up a piece of ore, sniffs it, rubs it between his fingers. Brown iron ore. And the smell. Sulfur. Lots of sulfur. That's why their steel is brittle. Sulfur makes iron red brittle. When forged, the metal cracks along the grain. And the locals fight it the only way they know how. They strike harder, they heat it hotter, and they drive even more sulfur inside. A vicious cycle. Dan takes a finished pommel. He scrapes it against a whetstone. The spark is short, dull. Low-carbon iron, not even steel, softer than nails from a hardware store in Pittsburgh. Halgrim watches him. One eye, but he sees for 2. Dan turns to Brand, asks for the broken sword, that very one, takes the shard, places it in the forge. Halgrim flinches. Dan gestures for him to wait. He watches the color of the metal. There are no thermometers here. Only the color. Dark red, cherry, light cherry. He takes it out 100 degrees earlier than Halgrim would have. He places it on the anvil and strikes. Not the blade, on the flat side, with short, even blows. He compacts the structure, drives out the slag. Halgrim snorts, says Dan is wasting the iron. Dan works. The forge again, forging again, 3 cycles, then quenching. He asks for hemp oil. Halgrim points to the jug in the corner and opens his mouth. He wants to say that it's tempered in cold water, that the oil is no good, that they don't do it that way. But Dan has already dipped the blade into the oil, and he's doing something Halgrim has never seen in his life. He places the blade on the smoldering coals and holds it there, watches the color of the surface, light yellow, straw-colored, dark straw-colored, right here. He removes it. Tempering, a procedure that doesn't exist in this world. After quenching, the steel is hard but brittle. Tempering relieves the tension. It makes it resilient. It teaches it to bend and spring back. No one here knows this. Dan clamps the blade in a vise. He strikes it flat with a hammer, at an angle. Just as an enemy's sword would strike, the blade bends toward his palm. Dan lets go. The blade springs back. Straight. Second blow. It bends. It springs back. Third, the same thing. Halgrim rises from the bench. Dan hands the blade to Brand. He tells him to try to break it. Brand presses the tip into the stone floor. He leans his full weight against it, over 100 kilograms. The blade bends into an arc. Brand presses down. The blade holds. Brand lets go. The blade stands straight, not a crack. Brand slowly lowers the sword. He looks at Dan. The smithy is quiet. Only the coals crackle. Halgrim takes a step forward. He takes the blade, turns it, strikes it with his fingernail. The blade rings out, a clear, even sound. It doesn't rattle, it rings. Halgrim raises his head. He looks at Dan with his one eye, and for the first time in 2 days, he says more than one word. He says to call the master, right now. Master Vaughn arrives 10 minutes later. For a man with a quarter of a lung, he moves quickly. He enters the smithy. He stops. He looks at the blade in Halgrim's hands. Halgrim silently hands him the sword. One takes it, turns it over, weighs it in his hand, then looks at Halgrim. Halgrim briefly recounts what happened. Juan listens, coughs. He listens further. Then he turns to Dan and says he wants to see everything from the beginning. Dan nods. He takes the second fragment from the rack, a piece of the old blade that Halgrim had kept for spare parts, and he repeats the entire process, from the very beginning, heating, forging with short blows to the die, 3 cycles, quenching in oil, tempering over coals until the temper lines turn a dark straw color. Vaughn stands nearby and watches. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't ask questions. He just watches. When Dan finishes, he clamps the second blade in the vise and strikes it again with the hammer. It bends. It springs back. It bends. It springs back. Vaughn takes the blade out of the vise. He tests it with his fingernail. It's hard. Then he tries to bend it with his hands. It springs back. He places the blade on the anvil. He sits down on the bench. And for 2 hours, he asks Dan questions. How many blades like this can he make in a day? Dan answers that he can make 1, maybe 2 if the furnace is ready and the charge is prepared. He asks what a charge is. Dan explains, a mixture of ore, coal, and additives in specific proportions. Every smelting run begins with preparing the charge. If the proportions are wrong, the metal will be poor. Vaughn asks if others can be taught this. Dan says they can, but it takes a long time, months, maybe years. Juan is silent. Then he asks what Dan needs to work. Dan says he needs to rebuild the furnace. He needs air control. He needs different bellows, more of them, more powerful ones. He needs ore from a different source, or a way to remove the sulfur from this one. He needs limestone for flux. He needs hemp oil in large quantities. He needs separate area for hardening and tempering, and he needs an assistant, one, a capable one, who will watch the fire and the bellows while Dan works at the anvil. Vaughn listens to everything. He coughs. He stands up. He says Dan will get what he asks for, not all at once, but he'll get it. Then he adds one thing. He says that in 5 months, the guild will have to renew its contract to guard the southern trade route. If the contract isn't renewed, the Order of the Flame will take it over, and that will be the beginning of the end. 5 months. Dan does the math in his head. Rebuilding the furnace. 2 weeks if he's lucky. The first test smelting runs. Another 2 weeks. Fine-tuning the process for the local ore. A month at least. Then, mass production. He might be able to arm 1 squad, 20 fighters, if everything goes smoothly. But nothing in production ever goes smoothly. Never. He tells Vaughn he'll try. Vaughn nods and leaves. Dan stays in the forge with Halgrim. The old blacksmith sits on a bench and looks at the 2 blades Dan has just made. He's silent for a long time. Then he says that his father forged swords for 40 years, and his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, 4 generations of the Kane family, and none of them ever did anything like this. He asks where Dan learned this. Dan thinks for a moment. Then he says that where he comes from, working with metal is studied as a science, with numbers and records and experiments, that every piece of steel can be described in terms of its chemical composition, that the heating temperature, the quenching medium, and the tempering time aren't a ritual, they're a calculation. Halgrim listens. His face is stony. Then he says he doesn't care about numbers and records. He asks one thing. Can Dan teach him to do the same? Not his apprentices. Him personally. Dan looks at the old blacksmith, one-eyed, 58 years old, hands like roots, 4 generations of the family, and here he sits, asking a stranger to teach him. That's worth more than it seems. Dan nods, says he'll teach him. Halgrim stands up, extends his hand. Dan shakes it. The handshake is short and firm. Halgrim turns toward the forge and says the furnace won't rebuild itself. They work until nightfall. Dan takes apart the top of the furnace. Halgrim helps in silence. Dan explains what he's doing. He says the old oven gives off heat that's too scattered. They need to narrow the chamber, increase the airflow, direct it not downward but sideways at a certain height. Halgrim listens and nods. After 3 hours of work, Brand arrives. He brings bread and boiled turnips. Dan eats without taking his eyes off the markings on the wall. He's sketching the oven's new configuration with charcoal. Brand looks at the sketch and says it looks like runes. Dan says they're not runes, but a cross-section. Brand asks what a cross-section is. Dan explains. If you cut the furnace from top to bottom and look at the insides from the side, that's a cross-section. Brand thinks for a second. Then he says that with living creatures, this is called an autopsy, and that he'd rather not be there. He leaves. Halgrim snorts hoarsely. It's the first sound resembling laughter that Dan has heard from him. They work for 2 more days. On the 3rd day, the furnace is ready. A new chamber, a narrowed throat, 2 large flues instead of 1 small one. Dan assembles the first charge. Ore, charcoal, limestone brought from a quarry half a day's journey away. Limestone is the key. It will bind the sulfur into slag and remove it from the metal. Local blacksmiths don't use limestone. They consider it a useless rock. 400 years away from the solution, and no one has tried it. Dan loads the charge. He lights the furnace. Halgrim pumps the bellows. Dan watches the flame. An hour later, the temperature reaches the right level. Dan adds a second batch. He waits. 3 hours later, he releases the first bloom. A lump of sintered metal and slag. Hot. Heavy. Dan breaks it apart. He looks at the fracture and feels something fall inside him. Sulfur. There's still too much sulfur. The limestone helped, but not enough. The ore is too dirty. He needs either more limestone or different ore. Dan sits down on the smithy floor, back to the wall. He stares at the ceiling. The first smelting is a failure. Halgrim stands nearby, silent. Then he says that in the old days, the masters prayed before smelting. Maybe Dan should try it. Dan looks at him. Halgrim looks back. Not a trace of mockery, serious as a rock. Dan says that prayers won't remove the sulfur from the iron. Halgrim shrugs and replies that they didn't help anyway, but at least they kept you occupied while you were thinking. Dan snorts. Then he stands up. He thinks. Sulfur. Sulfur binds with iron at high temperatures. Manganese binds sulfur better than calcium from limestone. We need manganese. Dan asks Halgrim if there's any black ore nearby, heavy, with shiny veins, the kind the locals consider useless or poisonous. Halgrim thinks. Then he says there's an abandoned mine beyond the northern pass. They mined something 40 years ago. They abandoned it because the metal from that ore turned out even worse than usual. Dan asks for a sack to be brought to him. Halgrim sends 2 apprentices. They return in 2 days. Heavy black ore with a distinctive sheen. Dan picks up a piece. He looks at it. Pyrolusite, manganese oxide. He's holding in his hands what the locals considered a worthless rock, what they abandoned 40 years ago. And he smiles for the first time since arriving in this world. The second smelting begins the next morning. The same ore, the same coal, the same limestone, plus pyrrhotite. A handful of black ore for each charge. The manganese will bind the sulfur into manganese sulfide. The slag will carry it to the surface. The iron will be purified. That's how metallurgy works. Not prayers, not rituals, chemistry. The smelting takes 4 hours. Halgrim pumps the bellows. Dan monitors the temperature. The bloom comes out. Dan breaks it. The next break. Finer grain, lighter in color, fewer scale marks. He takes a piece and strikes it against a whetstone, a long spark, with a fork. This is no longer just iron, it is steel. Not perfect, not tool steel, but steel, with normal carbon content and an acceptable sulfur level. Dan turns to Halgrim. He shows him the spark. Halgrim looks. He's been forging for 30 years and knows what a long, branching spark means, even if he doesn't know why. He sits down on the bench in silence. Then he says that in 30 years at the forge, he's never once seen a spark like that from local ore. Dan replies that it wasn't the local ore that made the difference. It's black stone. Halgrim shakes his head. He says his father wouldn't have believed it. Dan says his father would have learned too if he'd known what to look for. Halgrim is silent. Then he stands up and says they need to forge while the metal is still hot. They forge 6 blanks until late into the night. Dan shows Halgrim every step. The heating temperature, no higher than light cherry red. Forging with short strikes on the anvil, 3 cycles, quenching in oil, tempering until dark straw-colored. Halgrim repeats the process. His hands remember the rhythm in seconds. 4 generations at the anvil. The technique is flawless. The only thing he lacked was knowledge. Now he has it. By morning, 6 strips of steel lie on the workbench, all identical, all with a fine grain, all ring out when tapped. Halgrim picks one up. He tries to bend it. It springs back. He stands there, with the strip of steel in his hands, for a long time. Then he puts it back and says one word, tomorrow. Dan nods, tomorrow. They go their separate ways to sleep. Dan goes up to his room. He sits down on the mattress. His hands smell of scale and hemp oil. His back aches from 12 hours at the forge, and he feels good. For the first time in a long time, he feels truly good. Not because the world has become clearer, it hasn't, but because he stood at the forge and did his work, and the work turned out well. The smelting was a success. The steel rings. Tomorrow, he'll start forging blades. Dan closes his eyes and falls asleep in 3 seconds. For the next 3 weeks, Dan doesn't leave the forge. He sleeps 4 hours a day. He eats what Brand brings him. Work takes up the rest of the time. The 6 billets from the first successful smelting turn into 6 blades. Dan had been forging knives in his garage on weekends for 10 years straight. But forging a full-size blade is different. A different scale, a different strain on his hands and back. By the end of the first week, he has calluses on top of calluses and lower back pain that doesn't go away even in his sleep. Halgrim works beside him, silently, repeating what Dan showed him. Temperature, the rhythm of forging, hardening, tempering. The old blacksmith learns quickly. His hands have known the anvil for 30 years. He doesn't need to aim the blow. He just needs to understand when to strike and when to stop. By the end of the second week, Halgrim independently finishes a single blade from blank to finished product. Dan checks it, bends it, listens to the ring. Not perfect. The tempering was slightly overdone. The blade is softer than it should be, but it doesn't break. Dan tells Halgrim that next time he needs to take it off the coals 2 seconds earlier. Halgrim nods. He writes it down on a scrap of leather. This is another thing Dan introduced from day one. Records. Every heat, every hardening, temperature by eye, by color, holding time by count, hardening medium, result. Halgrim resisted at first. He said a real blacksmith keeps everything in his head. Dan replied that a real blacksmith might die tomorrow, and everything in his head would die with him. But the records will remain. Halgrim fell silent for half a day. Then he began to write. Brand comes into the forge every day. He brings food. Sometimes he sits and watches. He's not interested in the process, but in the result. He's waiting for blades for his squad, 20 scouts, the guild's best fighters, men who go on raids to the northern border and don't always return with a full complement. Brand shows Dan his squad, lines them up in the courtyard, 20 men. Dan looks at each one, at their height, at the length of their arms, at the width of their shoulders, at how each of them stands, how they hold their sword, right-handed or left-handed. Brand introduces them one by one. Kale, young, tall, long arms, strikes from above. He needs a blade 3 fingers longer than standard, with a weighted pommel for balance. Tora, a short, wiry woman. This is Jen, from Ji-hyun, the guild's best archer. She doesn't carry a sword, a bow, and a short knife. Dan looks at her bow, a simple wooden one, worn, a sinew string, limbs of different thicknesses. The bow isn't sized for her, but for someone larger. She compensates for the improper grip by tilting her torso. After 200 shots, her left shoulder will ache. After 1,000, she'll start having elbow problems. Dan takes note of this. Then Mar, a broad-shouldered veteran with a scar across his cheek. The very same one Dan saw on the first day. His sword curves at the tip. Mar strikes with a chopping motion, heavy. He needs a wide blade with a thick pommel. Dan walks along the line. He watches. He memorizes. 20 men, 20 different bodies, 20 different fighting styles, 20 blades that must be different. Brand asks how long it will take. Dan calculates. 3 smeltings, 60 blanks of which he'll reject at least half, 2 days to forge each blade, fitting the hilts and sheaths, 2 months, maybe 2.5. Brand nods, says he'll wait. Dan returns to the forge. By the end of the 3rd week, the first 6 blades are ready. He hands them to Brand, to Kyle, to Maru, to the 3 other scouts. Each blade is made for a specific person. Dan adjusted the length, weight, and balance. He changed the thickness of the pommel. He shifted the center of gravity. Kyle takes his sword. He makes a few test swings, stops, makes another one, a slow one, then looks at Dan, says the sword feels like it knows his hand. Dan replies that the sword doesn't know, but the blacksmith knew when he forged it. Mar silently tests his blade on a wooden post in the courtyard. 3 strikes. The post cracks. The blade is intact, no nicks. Mar runs his finger along the edge. He nods. He says nothing. But that evening, Dan finds a clay jug of honey by the door to his room. From Mar. Brand orders his men not to speak of the new swords outside the walls of Ironhold. It's too soon. Dan continues working, melting after melting, blade after blade. Halgrim is by his side. They hardly speak while they work. No need. Halgrim understands from a gesture, from a nod, from the way Dan looks at the metal. 30 years at the forge have taught him to read others' hands. By the end of the 1st month, Dan has 12 blades ready. 8 remain. And a new man comes to the forge, Torin, Halgrim's nephew, 24 years old, broad shoulders, dark hair, a closed, angry face. He walks in while Dan is working at the forge, stops at the entrance, stares. Dan feels his gaze between his shoulder blades. It's not curiosity, it's hatred. Quiet, precise. Torin grew up in this forge. He'd been learning from his uncle since he was 6. He was being groomed to become the guild's next senior blacksmith. 4 generations of the Kane family. Torin is the 5th. And then a stranger shows up, out of nowhere, with no family or name. And in 3 weeks, he does what the entire Kane family couldn't do in 200 years. Dan understands him. He understands the anger. He understands the pain. He went through something similar once himself. At the plant in Pittsburgh, when a new engineer from Stanford optimized a production line in a month that Dan had spent 2 years fine-tuning. It was humiliating, painful, and the guy was right. Dan knows that Torin will hate him. For a while, maybe for a long time. He doesn't try to fix it, doesn't bring it up, doesn't explain, just works. Torin comes every day, stands at the entrance, watches. After a week, he starts coming inside. Sits on a bench in the corner, observes. Dan ignores him. Halgrim stays silent too. One day, Dan drops his pliers. Torin mechanically hands them back. Their hands touch for a second. Torin pulls his away. He leaves. He returns the next day. He sits on the same bench. In the middle of the 2nd month, something happens that changes everything. Brand's squad goes on a raid to the northern outpost, a routine patrol. 2 weeks. Brand takes 6 men with new blades. The rest have their old weapons. They return in 10 days. 2 days early. Dan is standing in the courtyard when they enter the gate. Brand is in front. His face is serious. Behind him are his men. One is limping. Two have fresh bandages. They've been in battle. Brand approaches Dan. Silently, he draws his sword. He shows it to him. The blade is notched, deeply, but intact. Not broken, not bent. Brand says they encountered bandits at the pass. 30 men. His 6 men, armed with new swords, took the front line. They fought for half an hour. Not a single blade was put out of action. The old swords, 4 out of 8, broken, 2 in the first few minutes. Brand shows the shards. Dan takes one. The same fracture, coarse grain, fragile glass, just like that first broken sword he saw on the day he arrived. Then Cale approaches, young, long-armed Cale. His blade is also notched, but straight. Cale hugs Dan, silently, tightly. Dan's ribs crack. Cale lets go and walks away. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. That evening in the common hall, Brand recounts the battle by candlelight. The entire guild listens. Over 100 people. Brand doesn't sugarcoat it. He tells it like it is. 6 new blades against 30 bandits, not a single one broken. The hall is silent. Then one of the old veterans stands up and asks when he'll get one just like it. Dan sits in the corner. He's eating soup. He looks up. 100 pairs of eyes are on him. He answers that it'll be as soon as possible. But first, Brand's squad has to be finished, and then there'll be the next one. The veteran nods, sits down. Another stands up, asks the same thing. Dan repeats himself. A third, a fourth. Dan realizes what's happening. For the first time in a long while, these people want something. They're not just waiting to die, they want it. It's a different look, a different posture, a different voice. Hope. A thing more dangerous than any poison. Because if he lets these people down after giving them hope, they won't just be disappointed. They'll break. For good. Dan eats his soup. It's tasteless, but he finishes it. At night, he can't sleep. He lies on the mattress, stares at the ceiling, counts. 20 blades for Brand. That's the first thing. Then another 100 for the rest of the fighters. The furnace produces a maximum of 6 blanks per melt. Of those, 4 are usable at best. Melting takes a day. Forging a blade takes 2 days. He's alone. Halgrim helps, but he can't yet work independently through the entire process. 1 month won't be enough. He needs apprentices. He needs a production line. He needs a system. And a system starts with records. Dan gets up. He lights a candle. He takes a piece of leather and some charcoal. And he writes until morning. The first technical manual in this world. Charge composition. The smelting process. Forging temperatures by steel grade. The quenching medium. Tempering conditions by temper. Indicators of good steel. The color of the fracture. The nature of the sparks. The sound when snapped. Everything. From ore to finished blade. Every step. In the morning, he places the sheet on the workbench in the forge. Halgrim reads it. At length. He runs his finger along the lines. Then he looks up and says that if his father had seen this, he would have called it witchcraft. Dan replies that it's not witchcraft. It's a standard. Halgrim reads it over again. Then he carefully folds the sheet and locks it away in a chest. Dan asks why it needs to be locked away. Halgrim replies that this sheet is worth more than all the ore in the mine beyond the pass. Dan wants to object. Then he realizes the old man is right. In a world where knowledge is passed down by word of mouth and dies with the master, written technical specifications are a treasure. He nods. Halgrim locks the chest. He hangs the key around his neck. In the first month, Dan forged 12 of the 20 blades for Brand's unit. Each was tailored to a specific fighter. The first combat test at the northern outpost proved the superiority of the new steel. Not a single new blade broke in battle. Thorin, Halgrim's nephew, appeared in the forge and silently watched Dan at work. Dan wrote the first technical manual, and Halgrim locked it in the chest as a priceless treasure. By the end of the second month, 20 blades are ready. Dan lays them out on a long workbench in the forge. 20 swords, all different. Each has its own length, weight, and balance, but all are made of the same steel. All have undergone the same hardening and tempering process. They all ring with the same clear tone when tapped. Brand leads his squad. 20 men enter the smithy. Dan hands out the swords, one for each of them, by name. Kale takes his long blade with a weighted pommel. Mar takes his broad one with a thick pommel. Jen doesn't receive a sword. She stands to the side, arms crossed. She's an archer. She doesn't need a sword. Dan approaches her. He holds out a bundle. Jen unwraps it. Inside are 6 arrowheads, unlike anything she's ever seen. Narrow, faceted, with 3 stiffening ribs, made of the same hardened steel. Dan explains. These arrowheads weigh a third more than usual, but because of their shape, they fly more steadily, and pierce chainmail at 40 paces, leather armor at 60. Jen takes one arrowhead. She turns it in her fingers, runs the pad of her thumb along the edge, sharp, like a razor. She looks up at Dan. She says nothing, but something changes in her gaze. There was wariness. Now there is attentiveness. Dan takes note of this. The squad disperses. Brand stays behind. He says that in a week they're heading out on a long raid. 3 weeks, the southern border, the territory where the Order of the Flames patrols are starting to appear. Dan nods. He asks Brand to collect all the blades after the raid and bring them to him. He wants to see what the battle has done to his steel, where the nicks are, where the deformations are, where the weak spots are. Brand promises. That same day, Ayla Vaughn comes to the smithy for the first time, the magistrate's daughter. Dan has seen her from afar, tall, dark blonde braid, straight back. She walks in with a leather folder in her hands. She looks at Dan. She looks at the workbench where scraps of steel and slag from the last smelting still lie. She says she needs the numbers. Dan asks which ones. Ayla answers. Ore consumption per blade, coal consumption, oil consumption for hardening, limestone consumption, pyrolusite consumption, time per smelting run, time to forge a single blade, defect rate, forecast for the next quarter. She says this in an even voice, expressionless, like someone who asks these questions 10 times a day. Dan looks at her. Then he says, wait. He goes to his room. He returns with a sheet of parchment on which he's recorded every melt since day 1. He places it in front of Ayla. Ayla takes the sheet. She begins to read. A minute later, she looks up. Her eyes are different, not tired, alive. She asks what it is. Dan replies that it's a production log, every smelting run, input and output, consumption and yield. Ayla reads on. Dan watches her lips move. She's counting, checking his numbers in her head. She's a foreman. She lives in numbers. She finishes and sets the sheet aside. She stands in silence. Then she says that in 10 years in the guild, not a single blacksmith has ever given her anything like this. She asked, she begged, she demanded, she threatened. No one. Because no one kept records. No one calculated consumption. No one could tell her how much ore she'd need for the coming month. She managed the entire administrative side blindly. 10 years. Dan listens in silence. Ayla takes his sheet and presses it to her chest. Then she blinks rapidly, turns away toward the wall, stands like that for about 10 seconds, turns back. Her eyes are red, but her voice is steady. She says she needs a copy. Dan says he'll make a copy by tomorrow morning. Ayla nods. She leaves, quickly, doesn't look back. Dan stands in the smithy and watches her go. Halgrim quietly says that the girl has been carrying the guild on her shoulders for 10 years, and that her shoulders are tired. Dan nods. In the evening, he sits down and transcribes the production log. He makes a table. Ore consumption per smelting batch, steel yield, percentage of usable billets, forecast of demand for the next 3 months. He's used to this kind of work at the plant. He did it every Monday. Routine, nothing special. But here, it's not routine. Here, it's something unprecedented. A document. In the morning, he places a copy on the table in Ayla's small room. She's still asleep. He leaves. 2 hours later, she comes to the forge. His table is in her hands. She sits down on the bench across from Dan and starts asking questions. Is it possible to increase the yield of usable billets? Dan says it's possible if he gets a second furnace. One furnace for smelting, the second for heating for forging. That will double the speed. Ayla asks how much it would cost to build a second furnace. Dan gives a rough estimate. There's stone, there's clay, we need bellows. We need a forge separate from the smelting furnace. We need more hands. Ayla takes notes. They talk for 4 hours. Dan doesn't notice how time flies. She asks the right questions, not about the magic of metal, about economics, about logistics, about how many people are needed, where to find them, and what to feed them. She thinks like a manager. Dan is used to that kind of thinking at the plant. This is the first time he's seen it here. When she leaves, Halgrim says he last saw that sparkle in her eyes 5 years ago. Dan doesn't say anything, but he notices that he thinks about her for the rest of the day, between smelting runs, between hammer blows. He pushes the thought away, not the time. A week later, a problem arises. The pyrolusite supply is running out. The abandoned mine beyond the pass yielded only 3 sacks. That was enough for the first smelting runs, but more is needed going forward. Dan goes to see Vaughn. The master is sitting at his desk. He coughs. He listens. Dan explains that without black ore, he'll be back to using that lousy, brittle iron. That manganese is the foundation of everything he does. Vaughn asks where else they can find such ore. Dan doesn't know. He's been in this world for 2 months. He knows chemistry, not geography. Vorn summons Ayla. Ayla arrives with a map. She unfolds it on the table. Dan sees a map of this world for the first time. The kingdom of Valdemar is in the center, Castlelot to the west, the Order of the Flame to the south, the Grey Steppe to the east, Ironhold on the northern border, a tiny dot. Ayla says there are mines in the foothills to the northeast, but they're in disputed territory. Technically, they belong to no one. In reality, nomads from the steppe are there. Dan asks if a deal can be made. Ayla says we can try, but we need a squad to guard the caravan and goods to trade. The guild has neither in abundance. Vaughn is silent. He coughs. Then he says the guild has something the nomads don't. Good steel. If Dan makes a batch of knives, simple ones, sturdy ones, made of the same steel as the swords, the nomads will pay with ore. Dan does the math. 20 knives, a week's work, plus travel time, plus negotiations, a month at best. But without ore, he'll be out of business in 2 months. He has no choice. He agrees. He forges 20 knives in 6 days. Simple, straight, blade as long as a palm, fully hardened and tempered. Every knife springs. Each one holds its edge. Each one is worth, by local standards, as much as 3 ordinary swords. Brand has already left on a raid. Mar is leading the caravan into the foothills. 10 fighters, 2 wagons. Mar doesn't like diplomacy, but Vaughn says that nomads respect strength, and Mar looks like a man you don't want to anger. Mar leaves. Dan waits. He keeps working with what he has, the last reserves of pyrolusite. He's conserving it, melting it at half capacity. Halgrim helps. Torin still comes every day. He sits on a bench. He watches. He's silent. One day, Dan drops the hammer from exhaustion. He stands and stares at it. His hands won't obey him. 12 hours at the forge. Torin gets up from the bench, picks up the hammer, places it on the anvil. He looks at Dan, tells him to go to sleep. Dan looks at him. Torin doesn't look away. For the first time, without malice, just weariness for another person. Dan nods. He leaves, falls asleep instantly. Mar returns in 3 weeks. With him are 4 sacks of black ore, and a nomad, a short, wiry man with a weather-beaten face and narrow eyes. He introduces himself as Yerjan. He says his elder wants more knives, lots of them, that he's willing to pay with ore, as much as it takes, that they haven't seen steel like this in the steppe for generations. Dan looks at Ayla. Ayla looks at Dan. One thought between them. A constant source of raw materials, in exchange for products, a closed cycle. Ore goes in, steel comes out. Some of the steel goes back as payment for the ore. The rest goes toward arming the guild. It works. It can work. Isla smiles, for the first time in front of Dan. A narrow smile. Brief. 1 second. Dan remembers it. 20 blades for Brand's squad are ready and have been distributed to the fighters. Jen received special arrowheads. Isla Vaughn came to the forge for the figures and received the guild's first ever production log. A working partnership is beginning to form between her and Dan. The supply of pyrolusite ran out, and Dan solved the problem by trading with the nomads of the Grey Steppe. Mar brought ore and the middleman Yerjan. A steady channel for exchanging steel for raw materials has been established. Torin showed concern for Dan for the first time, the 3rd month in Ironhold. Dan begins building a second furnace. He's not alone. Halgrim is by his side. Torin, too. Halgrim's nephew arrived in the morning and stood silently by the pile of stones. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make requests. He just started hauling. Dan looked at him and said nothing. He accepted it as it was. For 3 days they lay the walls of the new furnace. Dan draws a plan with charcoal on a board. Torin looks at the drawing and asks why the chamber narrows toward the top. The first question he's asked in all this time. Dan explains. The narrowing accelerates the airflow. Faster air means more oxygen at the burning coal. More oxygen means a higher temperature. A higher temperature means better smelting. Torin listens. He nods. He asks a second question, then a third. By the end of the day, they're talking, not as friends, as master and apprentice. Halgrim stands to the side and listens. His face is inscrutable. But Dan sees the corner of his mouth twitch. Not upward, not down. Just twitching. That's the most emotion Halgrim is capable of. The second furnace is ready in a week. Now Dan has 2 furnaces. One for smelting ore into steel. The second for heating billets for forging. Before, he used to wait for the furnace to cool down after smelting before using it for heating. He'd lose half a day. Now one furnace smelts while he forges the products from the other. The speed doubles. 8 blanks a day instead of 4. 6 of them are usable, sometimes 7. The defect rate drops. Dan has perfected the process. He knows the local ore. He knows how much pyrrhotite to add. He knows the exact moment to remove the bloom. This isn't an experiment anymore. It's production. Halgrim is mastering the full cycle. He can run a smelting operation on his own, from charging the furnace to tapping the metal. His timing isn't perfect yet. Sometimes he overcooks it by 2 or 3 seconds, but every attempt is better than the last. Torin is starting with the basics. Dan puts him in charge of preparing the charge, weighing, mixing, loading. Boring work. But Dan explains why. If the charge is wrong, the whole smelting run will go down the drain. Trash in, trash out. Torin listens, memorizes, takes notes, without prompting. Dan notices this and says nothing, but mentally checks it off. The kid's learning. Brand returns from the southern raid. 3 weeks in the field. Casualties. 1 killed, 2 wounded. A skirmish with mercenaries of the Order of the Flame on the approach to Silver Pine Pass. Brand brings Dan the swords, all 20 of them. Dan lays them out on the workbench, inspects each one. Nicks, scuffs. One blade is slightly bent in the last third. Dan takes it. He straightens it with cold working. 20 blows with a wooden mallet. Straight. The nicks can be sharpened. No structural deformation. The blades held up. All 20. Brand sits down on a bench in the forge. He says he lost Hawk. A young guy. 21 years old. An arrow in the throat. Didn't have time to raise his shield. Brand says this flatly, without expression. But Dan sees his hands. His fingers grip the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles turn white. Dan is silent. He didn't know Hawk. Didn't have time to make him a sword that fit his hand. Hawk fought with an old blade. Brand says the Order is securing the pass, setting up outposts, hiring locals. In 6 months, they'll completely cut off the southern trade route. This is the very contract Vaughn was talking about. If the guild doesn't retake Silver Pine Pass, it will lose its last major source of income. Dan listens. He thinks. 40 guild fighters is the maximum Juan can field. The Order already has 120 at the pass, a 3-to-1 advantage. Even with the new steel, that's too many. Swords won't help if you're simply overwhelmed by numbers. We need something else. Dan goes out into the courtyard. He finds Jen. She's sitting on the roof of the stable, mending a bowstring. Dan climbs up to her. Jen looks at him with an expression that says he's crazy. Dan says he needs to talk about archery. Jen asks what exactly. Dan asks at what range her arrows can pierce standard chainmail. Jen replies that it depends on the chainmail. Good chainmail isn't pierced at all. Average chainmail at 15 paces. Bad ones at 25. Dan nods. He says his new arrowheads should pierce average chainmail at 40. Jen is silent. Then she says that's impossible, even with a good arrowhead. The problem isn't the arrowhead. The problem is the arrow's speed. And the speed depends on the bow. And her bow is junk, wooden, weak, not suited to her. Dan says he knows. He saw it. Jen tenses up, asks what he saw. Dan explains. The bow's limbs are different thicknesses. The grip doesn't fit her hand. She compensates by tilting her torso. In a year, she'll start having problems with her left elbow. Jen is silent for 10 seconds. Then she says the problems have already started, that her elbow aches after every long day at the range, that she hasn't told anyone. Dan nods. He says he'll make her a bow, not a wooden one, with limbs reinforced with steel plates, to her height, to her grip, to her draw length. Jen looks at him for a long time. Then she says that if he does what he promises, she'll personally shoot anyone who tries to touch it. Dan isn't sure if that's a joke. He goes back to the forge. For the next 2 weeks, he works on 2 things at once: blades for the remaining guild fighters and crossbow bolts. Not ordinary ones, with tips made of molybdenum. Dan knows that Mars supplies contain more than just pyrolusite. There's another ore. He found it at the bottom of the sack, dark, heavy, with a distinctive metallic sheen. Molybdenite. Molybdenum sulfide. The locals consider it a type of lead ore. They throw it away. But Dan knows that molybdenum in steel means a hardness that no one in this world has ever dreamed of. Molybdenum steel cuts through ordinary iron like a knife through butter. He begins his experiments. He adds molybdenite to the charge. First attempt. Too much. The steel turns out brittle. But not like sulfur does. Different. Glass-like hardness without ductility. He needs less. Dan adjusts the proportions. Second attempt. Third. On the fourth, he gets what he needs. A molybdenum steel tip. Narrow. Faceted. Dan clamps it in a vise. He places a piece of chainmail in front of it, the kind Halgrim had stripped from discarded armor. He takes the crossbow. He fires from 10 paces away. The bolt pierces the chainmail right through. It comes out the other side. It lodges in the wooden wall. Halgrim approaches. He pulls the bolt out of the wall. He looks at the tip. Not a scratch. No deformation. Halgrim quietly utters a single word that Dan doesn't know. Then he translates it. He says that in the old language it means dragon's tooth. Dan snorts. But the name sticks. The fighters start calling the molybdenum tips dragon's teeth. Dan doesn't argue. Fine. He forges 100 tips in 10 days. Halgrim helps. Torin prepares the charge. It's the first time the 3 of them have worked together. An assembly line. Torin stirs and loads. Halgrim melts the metal and removes the ingots. Dan forges and hardens the tips. Each one passes inspection. Dan checks the spark. He checks the ring. He rejects 12 out of 100. The remaining 88 are good. He puts them in a box. 88 arrowheads. Each one pierces chainmail from 40 paces with a crossbow. At Silver Pine Pass, the Order has 120 mercenaries in chainmail. The math is simple. Dan takes the box to Brand. Brand opens it, takes 1 arrowhead, turns it over in his fingers. Dan tells him about the chainmail test. Brand walks silently to the shooting range. He takes the crossbow, loads it, shoots at a target covered in chainmail and stuffed with straw. 30 paces. The bolt pierces the chainmail. It sinks halfway into the straw. Brand shoots again. 40 paces. It pierces through. 50. It pierces through, but not as deeply. Brand lowers the crossbow. He turns to Dan. He says that the Order has 120 men at the pass, and the Guild now has 88 of these things. He likes this kind of arithmetic. Dan says that arithmetic is arithmetic, but the bolts need to be fired before close combat begins. So we need positions. We need a strategy. We need time to reload. Bran nods. He says he'll take care of the strategy. Let Dan handle the weapons. Let those who know how to fight lead the war. Dan agrees. He's not a warrior. He's an engineer. His job is to give the warriors a tool. How they use it is their craft. In the evening, Dan sits in Isla's little room. She's at the table. He's on a bench by the wall. Between them is a cost sheet. Isla does the math. Molybdenite ore is more expensive than regular ore. The nomads charge double for it. If they make arrowheads in such quantities, their supply of knives for trade will run out in a month. They need to increase knife production. But knives take time that Dan could spend on swords for the other fighters. It's a vicious cycle. Isla draws a flowchart. Ore, coal, steel, swords, knives, tips. The arrows point in different directions. There aren't enough resources. There isn't enough time. There aren't enough hands. Dan looks at her diagram, and he sees a factory. The very same issue he's been tackling every week at the production meeting. Resource allocation, priorities, bottlenecks. He takes a piece of coal, draws over her diagram, divides production into 3 streams. Stream 1, swords, priority for unarmed fighters. Stream 2, knives for trade, minimum batch to maintain ore supplies. Stream 3, spearheads, a strategic reserve for the battle for the pass. Halgrim leads Stream 1, Dan leads Stream 3, Torin is on shift for both. Knives are made in between from rejects. Isla looks at his diagram. She is silent. Then she says, "It's beautiful." Dan asks, "What exactly?" Isla says the whole system, that for the first time in 10 years she sees structure instead of chaos, that for the first time she can plan more than a week ahead. They sit side by side at the table, close. Dan smells the ink on her hands. And something else, dry grass, maybe soap. He doesn't move, neither does she. The silence lasts a few seconds. Then Isla gathers the papers and says she has to go, that a wagon load of limestone is arriving tomorrow and she has to take delivery. Dan nods. She leaves. He sits for another minute. Then he gets up and goes to the smithy. He works until morning, because work is the only thing that doesn't ask questions he doesn't have answers to. Torin began learning from Dan and asked his first question about the furnace's design. The second furnace is built and production has doubled. Brand returns from a raid and reports that the Order of the Flame is establishing a foothold at Silverpine Pass. Dan has designed molybdenum steel arrowheads that pierce chainmail right through. The fighters have named them Dragon Teeth. 88 arrowheads have been forged for the battle for the pass. Ayla and Dan have set up a production distribution system with 3 streams. A bond is growing between them through their collaboration. There are 6 weeks left until the battle for Silverpine Pass. Dan counts every day, every smelting run, every bolt. 88 is good, but not enough. He needs 150. Better yet, 200, because half are lost in battle. Bolts break. They fly off into ravines. They get lodged in bodies and shields. 88 shots are 88 chances, and then the crossbows will be useless and close combat will begin. And there, it's no longer the arrowheads that decide the outcome. There, it's the blades and the men who wield them. Dan works. Halgrim works. Torin works. 3 men, 2 forges, 1 anvil. That's not enough. Catastrophically not enough. Dan tells this to Vorn. The master sits in his chair, coughs, listens, then says there's another blacksmith, not in Ironhold, in the village of Brynmore, 2 days' journey to the south. An old man named Oswald. He used to work for the guild. He left 10 years ago when things got really bad. He opened his own smithy. He makes horseshoes and shovels for the peasants. He says Oswald is a good blacksmith. Not Halgrim, but good. Maybe if he shows him the new method, He'll be able to make at least some knives to trade. That would free up Halgrim for arrowheads. Dan thinks. 2 days there, 1 day for training, 2 days back. 5 days without him in Ironhold. 5 days without smelting. No, he can't leave. But he could send Torin. The thought occurs to him, and Dan shudders at it. Torin has been training for 2 months. He knows the charge. He knows the forging routine. He's seen hardening and tempering dozens of times, but he's never gone through the full cycle from start to finish himself. Sending him to teach another blacksmith is like sending a student to give lectures. Insanity. But there are no other options. Dan calls Torin over. He explains the task. Torin listens. His face goes pale. He says he's not ready. Dan replies that he knows, but there's no one else. Torin is silent. Then he asks, what if he makes a mistake? What if Oswald doesn't understand? If the smelting fails? Dan says the smelting will fail. The first one. Maybe the second. Dan's first one failed too. That's normal. The main thing isn't the result of the first smelting. The main thing is that Oswald sees the principle, sees the difference, understands that there's another way. The rest will follow. Torin nods. Dan gives him a copy of the technical manual, the very one Halgrim keeps locked in a chest. Halgrim finds out about this and stays silent all day. Then he approaches Torin in the evening. He puts a hand on his shoulder. He says one sentence, "Don't let the forge down." Torin leaves in the morning. With him are 2 fighters for protection and a sack of pyrrolysite. Dan watches him walk through the gate, a sack of ore on his shoulder, his back straight. 24 years old, 5 generations of blacksmiths, and in his hands, knowledge that has no equal in this world. Dan turns to the forge. He works. 3 days after Torin's departure, Jen comes to the smithy. She's carrying her bow, an old one, wooden. She lays it on the workbench. She says her shoulder cracked yesterday, the upper one. She wrapped it in leather, but that's only for a day. Dan takes the bow. He looks at it. A crack running along the grain. The wood has dried out. This bow is dead. There's nothing to fix. Dan says he'll make a new one, just as he promised, but not a wooden one. Jen sits down on a bench. She folds her arms. She says she's listening. Dan explains. A composite bow. A wooden core for flexibility. Horn plates on the inside for compression. And steel strips on the outside of the limbs for tension. Thin ones, elastic, made of the same spring steel as the swords. A bow like this will shoot twice as far as a wooden one, and last twice as long. Jen listens. Then she asks how he knows how to make bows. Dan replies that he doesn't know. He knows the materials. He knows how elasticity works. He knows that steel springs better than wood. And she'll tell him how to assemble the bow, because she's an archer. She knows what's needed from a weapon. He knows what's needed from metal. Together, they'll make something neither of them could make alone. Jen is silent. Then she nods. They work together for 4 days. Jen comes to the forge every morning. Dan forges steel strips, thin, flexible, 2 fingernails thick. Jen tells him what shape the limb should be, what curve, what length. Dan adjusts the strips to her measurements, the draw length, grip strength, wrist angle. He measures everything. He writes it down. Jen gets angry at first. She says he's treating her like a workpiece. Dan replies that every workpiece is unique and deserves attention. Jen falls silent. Then she snorts. The bow is assembled by a woodworker from a village near Ironhold, an old man named Gunter. He makes the frame from ash wood. He attaches horn plates. Dan fastens steel strips to the outer side of the shoulders. Soft iron rivets, so they don't interfere with the bend. Leather wrapping on top. The bow turns out shorter than usual, but more powerful. Jen pulls the string taut. She tries it. She pulls it back to her ear, releases it empty, listens to the sound. The limbs snap back quickly, clean, no vibration. Jen takes an arrow with a new tip. She goes out to the shooting range. The target is 30 paces away, chainmail on a wooden shield. Jen takes her stance, left foot slightly forward, body straight, not leaning. For the first time, she isn't leaning. The bow is positioned under her, grip on the hand, draw according to strength. She pulls, aims for a second, releases. The arrow strikes the chainmail, passes right through, sticks into the wooden shield behind it, 30 paces away. Jen lowers the bow. She stands there. Dan stands beside her, silent. Jen turns to him. Her eyes are shining. She says that in her whole life, she's never had a weapon made just for her, not for some abstract archer, for her hands, for her height, for her way of shooting. Dan replies that that's how it should be, that a weapon is an extension of the hand. If everyone has their own hand, then they should have their own weapon. Jen is silent. Then she quietly says that he's a strange man. Dan agrees. She shoots for another hour, 40 paces. It pierces. 50. It pierces. 60. The arrowhead enters the chainmail, but doesn't go all the way through. It gets stuck. Jen nods. She says that 60 paces is the limit. For chainmail. For leather armor, it'll go further. Dan takes note. 60 paces. Chainmail. Penetration. That's 3 times more than with the old bow. Torrin returns in a week. His face is tanned. His hands are burned. He's brought news. Oswald agreed. The first smelting failed, just as Dan predicted. The second one worked. Not perfect, but it's steel. Oswald will make knives for barter, 10 a week. Torrin left him a copy of the regulations. Dan asks how the training went. Torrin is silent. Then he says that Oswald is a stubborn old goat. That on the first day he yelled at Torrin and kicked him out of the forge. That on the second day he watched in silence. That on the third day he tried it himself. That when a long branching spark flew from the new steel, Oswald sat down on the floor and sat there for a long time. Then he stood up and said that Torrin could come whenever he wanted. Dan listens. He looks at Torrin. He sees something new. Not anger, not resentment. Pride. Quiet. Well-deserved. Torrin had taught another blacksmith, passed the knowledge on. For the first time in his life, he was not an apprentice, but a master. And that changed him. Dan nods, says that Torrin did well. Torrin looks away, but the corners of his mouth twitch upward for a second. Halgrim stands by the forge. He looks at his nephew. He says nothing. But that evening, Dan sees the old blacksmith sitting alone on the steps of the smithy. He watches the sunset and whispers something quietly. Maybe a prayer. Maybe his father's name. Dan doesn't approach. There are some things an outsider shouldn't meddle in. The 4th month. 2 weeks until the battle for the pass. 160 spearheads are ready, plus 40 swords. 20 for Brand's squad, 20 for the rest of the fighters. The remaining 60 guild warriors are going with the old man weapons. Dan didn't make it in time. There wasn't enough time. There weren't enough hands. He's angry at himself, silently, at night. Isla finds him in the smithy at 3 a.m. He's sitting on the floor, with his back to the anvil. His eyes are closed. He isn't sleeping. He's thinking. Isla sits down beside him. She's silent for a minute. Then she says that he's done more in 4 months than the entire guild has in 10 years. Dan replies that it's not enough, that 60 fighters will go into battle with weapons that will break after the 3rd strike, that some of them will die because of it. Isla is silent. Then she says that some of them will die anyway, that this is war, that he can't save everyone. Dan knows that. He knew it at the plant when accidents happened. He knew you couldn't foresee everything. But knowing and accepting it are 2 different things. Isla puts her hand on his shoulder, gently, for a second. Then she takes it away. She stands up. She says he needs to sleep for at least 4 hours, that a supply convoy will arrive in the morning, and she needs his signature on the expense reports. Dan gets up, goes to sleep. He turns around at the threshold. Isla is standing alone in the forge. The light from the furnace coals falls on her face, dark circles under her eyes, deep. She is just as tired as he is, maybe more. Dan wants to say. He doesn't. He leaves. The battle for Silverpine Pass begins at dawn on the 5th month. 40 guild fighters leave Ironhold 3 days before the appointed date. Bran leads the way. Master Vaughn rides on horseback. He can barely stay in the saddle. A cough rips through him from the inside every 10 minutes, but he rides on, because this is his guild and his people, and if they die, he will die with them. Dan walks in the supply train, 3 wagons, one with bolts and spare arrowheads, the second with provisions, the third with tools. Dan brought a field horn with him, a small one, a folding one. Halgrim put it together in 2 days. If his blade breaks in battle, Dan will be able to repair it in the field. Not perfectly, but quickly. The Silver Pines Pass is a narrow bottleneck between 2 ridges. The only road from south to north runs through it. Whoever holds the pass controls the trade route. 2 years ago, the Order of the Flame wiped out a guild squad at this spot. 30 fighters, all dead. Since then, the Order has set up a garrison, wooden walls, 2 towers, 120 mercenaries inside. Bran knows this place. He was here when the guild squad was wiped out. He was the only one who survived. He made his way through the forest with a crossbow bolt lodged in his hip. He crawled for 2 days. Peasants found him. He doesn't talk about it. But Dan sees his face change as they approach the pass. His jaw tightens. His eyes go glassy. Brand looks at the wooden walls of the outpost and doesn't see them. He sees what happened 2 years ago. They set up camp in the woods half a mile from the outpost. Night. No fires. Brand positions his men. 20 crossbowmen on the slope. Dan personally checked every crossbow, every bolt, every tip. 160 dragon's teeth, plus regular bolts for over-the-shoulder shooting. 20 swordsmen below, 10 with new blades, 10 with old ones. Brand places those with the new steel in the center. They will go first. The rest on the flanks and in reserve. Jen on the right slope, alone, with her new bow. She is not in the crossbowmen's ranks. She is separate. Her task is different. Commanders. Brand showed her the outpost's layout, showed her where the commander's tent is, where the officers walk. Jen nodded. She doesn't need to be told twice. Dan stands on the hill next to Vaughn. The Magister sits on a folding chair, wrapped in a cloak, a map in front of him, a spyglass nearby. Dan brought a small board and charcoal. He'll be taking notes. How the arrowheads perform, at what distances, at what angles, how many hits, how many misses. This isn't cynicism. It's an engineering approach. If they survive, he needs the data to make the next batch better. Dawn. Fog in the gorge. Brand raises his hand. The crossbowmen on the slope draw their bows. The first volley, 20 bolts. Dan hears the sound, a short whistle, then impacts, dull, like a hammer on wet wood. Screams from the outpost. Dan looks through the spyglass. He sees. Mercenaries are jumping out of their tents. 3 are lying on the ground, not moving. Their chainmail is pierced. The bolts went in up to the fletching. It works. Second volley. Third. The mercenaries are hiding behind the walls, but the walls are wooden. A bolt from a crossbow at 30 paces pierces a 1-inch plank. Dan takes notes. Distance 35 paces. Angle of inclination 20 degrees. Penetration of chainmail confirmed. Penetration of wooden shield confirmed. Fourth volley. Fifth. The mercenaries try to form a line. Their commander yells from behind the wall. Jen fires. 1 shot. The commander falls silent. Dan doesn't see where the arrow hit. He only sees that the shouting has stopped. The mercenaries emerge from the outpost. They form ranks, shields forward. They advance up the slope. Brand gives the order. The crossbowmen fire point blank, 20 paces. At this range, the molybdenum tip pierces through the shield and the chainmail behind it. The first row of mercenaries falls. The second stumbles over the first. The third stops. Sixth volley. Seventh. Dan counts. 42 bolts expended. He counted 28 hits. 67% effectiveness. High for field conditions. The mercenaries retreat. They regroup. They change tactics. They split into 3 groups. 2 flank around. The third holds the front, skillfully. Their commander may be dead, but someone has taken command. Brand sees this. He gives the order to the swordsman. 20 men form a wall at the foot of the slope, 10 with new steel in the center. Clash. Dan hears the clang, sees flashes of steel, dust, screams. He records what he can, but the spyglass shakes in his hands. Close combat isn't a test bench, it's chaos. He sees Kale swinging with both hands from top to bottom, his long blade with a weighted pommel. The blow lands on the mercenary's shield. The shield splits. The blade is intact. Kale strikes a second time. The mercenary falls. Mar is on the right flank. His broad, heavy sword works like an axe, short, chopping strikes. Every other one hits its mark. Dan sees the mercenary's sword meet Mar's blade and break. The mercenary stares at the shard in his hand for a second. Mar doesn't give him a second. The battle lasts 40 minutes. Dan jots down numbers, no stopwatch. He counts by his pulse, roughly. The crossbowmen have fired 80 bolts. Jen has shot 22 arrows. The mercenaries have lost about 40 men, killed and wounded. The remaining 80 retreat to the outpost. They close the gates. Brand isn't pursuing them. He's reorganizing his men, counting the casualties. 2 dead, both with old swords. The blades broke in close combat. 1 fighter was left unarmed. He grabbed a mercenary's shield, fought with it, but a spear thrust found an opening. 7 wounded. 2 are seriously injured. The healer Maggie is right there, red-haired, freckled. Her hands are covered in blood up to her elbows. She's stitching a wound on the fighter's thigh with a regular needle, thick, crooked. Dan watches her work. He sees how the needle tears the flesh instead of piercing it. He sees the fighter clench his teeth. He takes it all in. Day 2. The mercenaries aren't coming out. They're holed up behind the walls, waiting for reinforcements. Brand knows reinforcements will arrive in 3 or 4 days. They need to finish before then. At night, crossbowmen fire a barrage at the outpost, ordinary bolts, not molybdenum ones. Those are too valuable. They set 3 tents on fire. The mercenaries put them out. They don't sleep. By the morning of the 3rd day, they're exhausted. Brand attacks at dawn. A second wave of bolts, 50 arrowheads. The outpost's gate, wooden. Brand sent 4 men with a battering ram. The gate doesn't hold. The swordsmen enter. Close quarters combat. Man against man. This is where the new steel shines brightest. The mercenaries' blades shatter against the guild's blades. Dan watches from the hill. He counts. By noon, it's all over. The mercenaries have surrendered. Those who remained. 63 men. The rest are dead or have fled. The guild lost 4. 2 on the first day. 2 during the assault. All 4 with old swords. Not a single fighter with the new steel was killed. Dan writes this down. He circles the number. 0. In the evening, Brand stands before the ranks, the outpost courtyard. The guild's gray standard flies above the tower, a hammer on a black field. Brand speaks briefly. He names the 4 who died. A moment of silence. Then he says that the pass belongs to the guild once more, that the southern trade route is open, that the name of gray steel has returned to the map. Dan stands off to the side, near the wagons. He writes down the final figures: bolt consumption, tip losses, hit percentage by range. Vaughn approaches him. The master can barely stand. The battle has drained his last ounce of strength. He looks at Dan's notepad, at the numbers. Then he says he's seen many battles, that none of them were won by numbers. Dan replies that they were all won by numbers. It's just that no one used to count before. Juan looks at him, coughs, then laughs quietly. For the first time in Dan's presence, the hoarse, gasping laugh of a sick man. He says that Dan is the strangest master he has ever met, and that without him, a stranger's banner would be flying here today. The guild recaptured Silver Pine Pass, 40 fighters against 120 mercenaries of the Order of the Flame. Molybdenum pommels and new blades gave the decisive advantage. 4 guild fighters died, and all 4 were armed with old swords. Not a single fighter with the new steel was lost. Jen took out the mercenary commander with her new bow. Dan recorded full battle statistics to improve the next batch. Maggie tended to the wounded, and Dan saw a problem with her tools. After returning to Ironhold, a week of silence passes. The guild buries the 4. Maggie tends to the wounded. Brand writes a report for the guild council. Dan sits in the smithy and works on what he's been thinking about ever since he saw Maggie stitching a wound with a thick, crooked needle. Surgical instruments. He starts with needles. He takes thin wire made of the finest steel. He pulls it through a die. He sharpens it. He polishes it. He makes an eye. 3 days for 10 needles. Thin, sharp, with a perfectly smooth surface. A needle like this doesn't tear the tissue. It pierces it. It goes in and comes out, cleanly. Then the scalpels, small blades about a finger's length, made of hardened steel, tempered to a straw-like finish. The blade is sharpened so that it cuts effortlessly. Dan remembers how their safety engineer at the plant used to show them medical-grade steel. Grade 420, chromium alloyed, stainless. He doesn't have chromium, but he can provide maximum surface purity and the right tempering. Then the clamps, tweezers, hemostats. He makes them from the same metal. A riveted hinge, the jaws close perfectly, no gap. It's fine jewelry work. Haugram stands nearby and watches. He says he's never forged such small items before. Dan replies that small things save lives just as well as big ones. A week later, his set is ready. 10 needles, 3 scalpels of different sizes, 2 clamps, tweezers. Everything is packed into a leather case that Lien sewed. Dan notices Lien for the first time at that moment, Jen's younger sister, a quiet girl with big, dark eyes. She came to the smithy to ask if Dan needed a case for his tools. She saw what he was making. She understood what it was for. She offered to make it herself. She sewed it herself. Dan takes the case. Neat work, even stitches, each tool in its own pocket. He thanks her. Lien nods and leaves silently. Dan watches her go. He thinks there are too many people in this guild whom no one notices. He carries Maggie's kit. The healer sits by the wounded man's bed. She's bandaging a burn. Dan sets the case on the table. Maggie opens it. She takes a needle, turns it between her fingers, holds it up to the light, runs her fingertip along the blade. Her eyes widen. She takes a scalpel, tests the blade on a scrap of fabric. The fabric parts without a sound, like paper. Maggie puts the scalpel back, slowly, carefully. She takes a clamp, opens it, closes it. The jaws come together evenly. It clicks. She holds it. She lifts her head, looks at Dan. Her eyes are full of tears. She says that in 15 years at Ironhold, she has stitched up more than 1,000 wounds with a thick leather needle, because there was no other. That every time the fabric tore under the needle and she couldn't make a clean stitch. That 2 fighters died not from their wounds, but from infection because the stitches came apart. That she'd dreamed of tools like these from day one. Dan is silent. Maggie stands up. She hugs him, tightly. Her hands smell of herbs and honey and something bitter. She doesn't let go for a long time. Dan stands there, not knowing where to put his hands. Then he gently places his palms on her back. Maggie pulls away. She wipes her eyes. She says that if he ever needs someone to stitch him back together piece by piece, she'll do it, so there won't be a scar left. Dan says he'll try not to give her that kind of work. Maggie laughs, a warm, low cheep. The first sound of life in the infirmary in a week. News of the battle for the pass spreads quickly. Too quickly. In 2 weeks, all of Veldmar knows about it. Caravanners tell the stories in taverns. Merchants pass them on in the cities. The Grey Steel Guild, with 40 fighters, routed 120 mercenaries of the Order. They lost 4. Their weapons pierced chainmail from a distance. Their swords didn't break. They have a master, a stranger, from a distant land, who forges steel unlike anything ever seen in these parts. Dan wanted peace and quiet. He got fame. And fame is noise. The first to arrive are trade agents from Castlot, 3 of them, well-dressed with bags of silver. They offer Dan a contract, 10 years, a private forge in the Republic's capital, unlimited funding, the title of Master of the First Guild. Dan refuses, politely. The agents leave. A week later, others arrive, with a bigger bag. Dan refuses. Another week later, it's not an agent who arrives. A woman arrives. Evelyn Moore, 29 years old, envoy of the Castlot Trade Council. Her light hair is styled in a simple updo. Her clothes are expensive, heavy wool and silk. She enters Ironhold as if entering her own home, calmly, confidently, without a single unnecessary glance around. Vaughn receives her in the hall. Dan is present. Ayla too. Evelyn says that the Castlelot Council is ready to offer the guild a treaty of alliance, military support, funding, the opening of trade routes, in exchange for exclusive supplies of a new type of steel, and Master Rice as the chief blacksmith of the joint venture. Dan listens. This isn't an offer to buy him out. It's smarter than that. It's an offer to buy out the entire guild, with him inside. Vaughn is silent. He coughs. He looks at Ayla. Ayla looks at her notes. She's calculating. Dan knows what she's calculating. Castlelot's funding will cover the guild's debts for the next 3 years. New routes will double the income. Military support will protect them from the Order of the Flame. It's a good deal. On paper. Dan says no. Evelyn turns to him. No surprise, no anger, icy politeness. She asks why. Dan answers, because exclusivity means dependence. Today, Castlelot is an ally. Tomorrow, a partner. The day after tomorrow, a master. In 5 years, the guild will be a workshop in Castlelot's production line. Nameless, without freedom, no choice. Evelyn is silent for 3 seconds. Then she says the guild has no choice anyway. That without outside support, the Order of the Flame will crush them within a year. That King Veldmar doesn't need them. That the nomads are unreliable. That she is the only option. Dan replies that she isn't the only option. She's the best of a bad lot, and he'd rather find a good one. Evelyn looks at him for a long time. Then she turns to Vorn. She says she'll stay in Ironhold, as an observer, until the council recalls her. Vorn agrees. It's not in his interest to refuse. Having Castlelot's observer in the fortress is informal protection. Castlelot won't attack a place where their messenger is stationed, and the Order will think twice before touching people under Castlelot's watch. Evelyn is given a room in the tower, 1 floor below Dan. Every morning, she steps out into the courtyard in immaculate attire. Every evening, she dines in the hall with the guild officers. She listens. She observes. She takes notes. Dan sees her notes once, by accident. She left her notebook in the hall. He glanced inside. Neat, small handwriting. Numbers. Names. Diagrams. She's counting the fighters. Counting the supplies. Counting the swimsuits. She's doing the same thing as Ayla, only for the other side. Dan returns the notebook. He says nothing. But he starts paying attention to what information is discussed in her presence. Ayla notices this. She comes to him that evening. She says that Evelyn is dangerous, not as a person, as a function. She is Castlelot's tool, and she does her job well. Dan agrees. He says he'll be careful. Ayla nods. She leaves. She stops at the door. She says she doesn't like the way Evelyn looks at Dan during dinner. Dan asks how. Ayla replies, intently. She leaves without waiting for an answer. Dan stands in the doorway. He thinks. Then he goes to the smithy, because the smithy doesn't ask questions he doesn't want to answer. Dan has crafted a set of surgical instruments for the healer, Maggie. Word of the victory at the pass has spread throughout Veldmar. Castlelot's trade agents have arrived with offers that Dan has rejected. Evelyn Moore, an envoy from the Castlelot Council, arrived in Ironhold with a proposal for a treaty of alliance. Dan refused, and Evelyn remained in the fortress as an observer. Lien took the initiative for the first time, and Dan noticed her. Ayla warned Dan about Evelyn. The 6th month. Dan stands in the forge and realizes he needs help. Not an extra pair of hands at the forge. Not another blacksmith. He needs someone to keep records, to organize the data, to copy blueprints, to keep track of the smelting log, to prepare charge calculations based on the formulas Dan devised. He spends 3 hours a day on paperwork. 3 hours he could spend at the anvil. He loses 3 blades a week to paperwork. He thinks about it for 2 days. Then he goes to look for Lien. He finds her in the Ironhold library, a small room in the tower, 3 bookcases, half of them in languages Dan doesn't know. Lien is sitting at a table, reading, a thick volume in a leather binding. Dan looks over her shoulder. The History of the Grey Steel Guild, a chronicle spanning 200 years. Lien looks up. She looks at him with her big dark eyes. She waits. Dan says he needs an assistant, not in the forge, at a desk. Someone with a good memory and neat handwriting. Someone who can read and count and isn't afraid of numbers. Lien closes the book. She asks why he came to her. Dan replies that she sewed a case for Maggie's tools, not because she was asked to, because she saw and understood. A person who sees and understands without explanation is exactly the one he needs. Lien is silent. Then she says her sister will be against it. Dan asks why. Lien replies that Jen thinks she's too young for serious work, that she treats her like a child, that she always has. Dan says that Jen is the guild's best marksman, but that doesn't make her an expert on other people's abilities. Lien raises an eyebrow, the first sign of life Dan sees on her face. Then she nods. She says she agrees. She starts the next day. Dan seats her at a table in the corner of the smithy. In front of her is a notebook, a stack of blank leather for notes, charcoal for writing, ink that Ayla found in the supplies. The first task, to transcribe all of Dan's notes into a single logbook, by date, with the smelting batch numbers, with the composition of the charge and the result noted. Lien gets to work. 2 hours later, Dan checks it. The handwriting is even, small, perfectly legible, not a single mistake in the numbers, not a single omission. He nods. Lien continues. By the end of the first week, the batch log is in order. 52 batches over 5 months. Each is documented, each with a result. Dan looks at it and sees his work as a whole for the first time, not individual runs, a system, a learning curve. The first runs, unstable, lots of rejects. The middle ones, more stable, fewer rejects. The last ones, almost no rejects. The percentage of usable blanks rose from 40 to 85 in 5 months. It's a good curve. It's the curve of a functioning production line. Lien looks at him, asks what he sees. Dan explains, draws the curve on the board. The horizontal axis shows the casting number. On the vertical axis, the percentage of acceptable parts. The line goes up, not smoothly, with jumps, but up. Lien looks at the curve. Then she says it's beautiful. Dan asks, what exactly? Lien replies that it's the growth, that seeing something get better day by day, that there's nothing like that in the books about the guild. There are only lists of the dead and lost contracts, a curve going down. But here it's going up, and that's beautiful. Dan looks at her, 19 years old, quiet, observant. She sees what others don't. He nods, says she's right, and gives her a second assignment, blueprints. Dan has dozens of sketches, charcoal on scraps of leather, diagrams of furnaces, blade profiles, tip designs. Everything is scattered, everything is messy. He needs clean copies, neat ones, with dimensions, with explanations. Lien takes his sketches. She studies them. She asks questions, lots of questions. What does this line mean? Why is there a taper here? Why this angle and not another? Dan answers, and he notices that her questions are getting more precise with each passing day. She isn't just copying, she understands. In the third week, she brings him a drawing of a new arrowhead. His sketches reworked into a clean diagram, with dimensions, with angles, with material specifications, and with one change. Lien has shifted the center of gravity 2 millimeters toward the tip. Dan asks why. Lien explains. She watched Jen shoot. An arrow with a forward center of gravity flies more steadily at long distances. Jen shoots at 60 paces, so the center of gravity must be forward. Dan looks at the drawing, then at Lien, then back at the drawing. She's right. 2 millimeters, a trifle, but a trifle that matters. He says he'll make the change in the next batch. Lien nods, calmly, as if she hadn't done anything special. Halgrim sees this from behind the horn. He approaches Dan as Lean leaves. He says the girl is dangerous. Dan asks in what sense. Halgrim replies that in a good way, that in 2 years she'll know more than Torin, not with her hands, with her head. That Dan needs to be careful because when the apprentice becomes smarter than the master has to grow. Dan snorts. He says that's the best problem anyone could have. Halgrim shrugs. He returns to the horn. At the end of the 6th month, Dan goes down to the basement of the old tower. He knew about the basement before. Brand had mentioned that it was a storage area for the guild founder's old belongings. But until now, he hadn't had the time. Now Lien has taken over the paperwork. Dan has an extra hour a day. He spends it in the basement. He goes down the stone staircase. The air is cold. It smells of dampness and stone. Downstairs is a long corridor, doors on both sides. Most are open. Empty rooms, shelving, dust. One door is locked, an old lock, rusty. Dan goes to Halgrim for a tool. He returns. He picks the lock. He opens the door. The room is small, stone walls, a workbench along one wall, shelves along the other. A finger-thick layer of dust on the workbench, tools under the dust. Dan clears it away and freezes. A hammer, pliers, a set of punches, a small anvil. The tools are old, at least 200 years old, but the shape. Dan picks up the hammer. The balance is perfect. The head is rounded differently than those of the local blacksmiths. Differently, in a modern way, like the hammer Dan bought at a store in Pittsburgh. He puts the hammer back. His hands are shaking. He looks further. Scrolls on the shelves, leather cracked by time. Dan picks one up, unfurls it, carefully. Text. Unfamiliar letters, but not entirely. Dan peers closely. He reads the first word and sits down on the floor. Because the first word is carbon, written in Latin script, on the cracked leather, 200 years ago. He reads on. It's a mixture, simplified Latin interspersed with modern technical terms. Carbon content, temperature, quenching, tempering. Someone 200 years ago wrote about carbon content and quenching and tempering in a language that only someone from Dan's world could have known. Dan unrolls the second scroll, the third. Records. Dozens of records, a smelting log, exactly like the one Dan keeps. Charge compositions, quenching regimes, results. The author's name on the first page, Nathaniel Gray. Nathaniel Gray. Dan sits on the basement floor, holding a 200-year-old scroll, and he realizes he isn't the first, that someone was here before him, an engineer, a metallurgist, a man from his world, 200 years ago, and this man founded the Gray Steel Guild. Gray. Gray. Dan shifts his gaze to the last scroll, the shortest one. He unrolls it. The text breaks off mid-sentence. If you're reading this, that means there are 2 of us now. Don't trust anyone. Then a stain. Brown. Old. Blood. Dan sits in the basement, holding the dead man's message in his hands. 200 years. And the message had been waiting for him. Dan hired Leanne as an assistant to keep a log of the dives and drawings. She quickly got the hang of it and made her first independent improvement to the tip's design. In the basement of the old Ironhold Tower, Dan discovered the sealed workshop of the guild's founder, Nathaniel Gray. The notes written in a mixture of Latin and modern technical terms prove that Nathaniel was a traveler from Dan's world. The last note was torn off at the warning and covered in blood. Dan spends 3 nights in a row in the basement. He reads Nathaniel Gray's notes. Leanne is by his side. She is the only one to whom he has shown his discovery. Not Vona, not Eiley, not Brand. Leanne. Because she doesn't need an explanation of what notes from another world are. She reads and accepts, without panic, without unnecessary questions. She simply works. She transcribes. She organizes them. Nathaniel's notes consist of 47 scrolls. Most of it is technical: steel compositions, furnace designs, blueprints for tools. Dan reads them and sees his colleagues' work. Nathaniel knew less than Dan. His metallurgy is late 19th century level. The Bessemer process. Pudding. Not a word about alloying with molybdenum or tungsten. But for this world, his knowledge was more than enough. He built Ironhold's first real furnace, the very one that Dan took apart and rebuilt in the first week. It operated according to Nathaniel's design for 200 years. It deteriorated. It became patched up. But the foundation was sound. Nathaniel knew what he was doing. Among the technical records are personal ones. Not many. Nathaniel didn't like to write about himself. But something comes through. He arrived in this world at the age of 31. An engineer. He worked at a steel mill in Sheffield, England. The year of his death in that world was 1883. He died in a mine collapse. He woke up in the snow, like Dan. It wasn't scouts who found him, peasants. They brought him to the village. He worked as a blacksmith for 2 years. Then he founded a guild. Not alone, with a group of fighters whom he armed with his steel. The first banner, a gray hammer on a black field. Gray, gray. His name became the name of the guild. Dan reads the diary. Nathaniel wrote sparingly, facts, dates, salts. But sometimes he let something slip. One entry, short. Today, a boy from the village brought me a broken knife, asked me to fix it. I fixed it, made a new one, better. The boy left happy. I sat in the smithy and thought about how I had no son at home. And here there is a boy whose knife I can fix. Maybe that's enough. Dan closes the scroll. He sits in the darkness of the basement. The candle burns steadily. Lien is beside him. She is silent. Then she asks, what's wrong with him? Dan says that this man, Nathaniel, he was like Dan, alone in a strange world, with his hands and his head and nothing else. And he built all of this, the guild, the fortress, 200 years of history. And he died. And his records waited 200 years in the dust, in the darkness. Lien is silent. Then she says, the records waited, that it matters. Dan nods. The last scrolls are the most important. Nathaniel writes about the passages. 3 points in the world where the boundary between worlds is thin. One beneath Ironhold. Nathaniel found it by accident. He went down into the basement, which was a cave back then, and saw a strange glow on the far wall. He describes the artifact. A copper disc the size of a palm, with an engraving that resembles an electrical diagram. Nathaniel couldn't understand it completely. His knowledge wasn't enough, but he realized that the disc was connected to the passage, that the passage works both ways, that the passage reacts to certain people, not everyone. Nathaniel wrote that the passage responds to those who died with the right thought. Dan pauses. He remembers. The last second before the truck, the headlights, the impact, and a thought. I didn't even have time to take off my helmet. A thought about work, about metal, about the familiar gesture I'd made 1,000 times. Take off the helmet after the shift, an engineer's thought. Nathaniel died in a cave-in in the mine. His last thought was surely about the rock, about the supports, about something related to his work. The passage responds to craftsmen, to people whose last thought is about their craft. Dan puts down the scroll. His hands aren't shaking, but inside, something is heavy. The second passage is in the south, in the lands of the Order of the Flame. Nathaniel knew about it, but didn't find it. He only marked its approximate location on the map. The third passage is unknown. Nathaniel heard about it from someone. He didn't write down who. And the last entry, that very one, abrupt. If you're reading this, it means there are 2 of us now. Don't trust. Who not to trust? The scroll is silent. The blood on the parchment dried 200 years ago. Dan doesn't know, but he's starting to figure it out. There are 2 of us now. That means there was someone else, a third person. Nathaniel knew about him, or her, and didn't trust them. And the blood on the note says that the distrust was justified. Dan gathers the scrolls, hides them in a chest in his room, the key around his neck, like Halgrim with the regulations. In the morning, he goes to Vaughn. He doesn't mention the notes. He talks about the workshop in the basement. He says he found the guild founder's tools, old but good. Vaughn nods. He says he knew about the basement. His father told him, but no one has gone down there in 50 years. Dan asks what Vaughn knows about the founder. Vaughn says not much. Nathaniel Gray came from distant lands, founded the guild, ruled it for 40 years, died in his bed, buried in the courtyard of Ironhold, a gravestone by the eastern wall. Dan walks to the grave, a simple stone. The inscription has worn away almost completely. He makes out 3 words: Nathaniel Gray, Master. He stands by the grave of a man from his own world, 200 years apart, one fate, one path. Snow, a foreign world, steel. Lean approaches quietly. She stands beside him. She is silent. Then she says she found something else, in the last scroll, between the lines. Dan turns. Lean shows him a piece of leather, the very one, with the torn note. She holds it up to the light, at a certain angle, and Dan sees indented letters, not in ink, with something sharp, on dry leather, almost invisible. 2 words, the third passage, and below, wipe it clean. Nathaniel wanted to destroy the third passage, or whatever came through it, or whoever came through it. Dan takes the leather, looks at the indented letters, then at Lean, says not a word. Not a word. Lean nods, seriously, without hesitation. 19 years old, but at that moment, Dan doesn't see her age. He sees a person to whom he can entrust a secret worth a life. They return to the smithy. Dan takes a hammer. He works, because for now, he doesn't know what to do with the secret. But Steel always understands. A month passes, the 7th since Dan's arrival. The guild is changing. Not quickly, but noticeably. 2 forges are running a full shift. Halgrim handles the first batch on his own. Torin joins in, forging simple items, knives, tips for ordinary arrows, staples, horseshoes, all made from the new steel, all by the book. Oswald in Bryn Mawr makes 10 knives a week. They go to the nomads. The ore comes back. The channel is working. Yerzon comes once a month. He brings pyrrhotite and molybdenite. He takes the knives away. He has become part of the system, not an ally, a partner. The difference is important. Isla keeps the books. Her spreadsheets are growing. The guild's revenue for the last quarter has risen by 40%. The contract for Silver Pine Pass has been confirmed. Caravans are on their way. The guild charges a toll. For the first time in 3 years, the treasury isn't empty. Vaughn summons Dan to his office. The magister sits at his desk. Before him lies a letter bearing the royal seal. Vaughn says that King Valdemar demands Master Rice's presence at court. He isn't asking. He's demanding. Formally, it is an invitation. In fact, it is an order. Refusal will be considered insubordination. Dan reads the letter. Beautiful handwriting. Polite phrasing. Behind every phrase, the clang of steel. Vaughn asks what Dan intends to do. Dan says he won't go anywhere. Vaughn nods. He says he knew Dan would answer that way. He says it means war. Not direct war, not yet, but the king won't forget, and he won't forgive. Dan says he knows. Vaughn coughs, long and hard. Then he straightens up. He looks at Dan. He says that in 30 years at the head of the guild, he has never once refused the crown. That his father never refused. That his grandfather never refused. That refusal is the end of the old world. Dan replies that the old world has already ended. That the new one began the day the first blade forged from his steel came out of the forge. Vaughn is silent. He looks at Dan. Then he says quietly that Dan is right, and that knowing he's right doesn't make it any easier. Dan leaves the office. Isla is standing in the hallway. She heard everything. The walls in the tower are thin. She looks at Dan. Her eyes are dry, Her back is straight. She says that if the king sends troops, they have 400 fighters and the walls of Ironhold and his steel. Dan says that might not be enough. Ayla says it will be enough. Because it has to be enough. Because there is no alternative. Dan looks at her. At this woman who has carried a dying guild on her shoulders for 10 years, who has never broken, who crunches the numbers that tell her it's all over and yet gets up every morning and keeps working. He wants to tell her she is the strongest person he has ever met in both worlds. He doesn't say it. He walks away. He goes to the smithy. He has work to do. Dan studied Nathaniel Gray's records and learned of 3 passages between worlds, one beneath Ironhold, the second in the south, in the lands of the Order of the Flame. The third is unknown. Lien discovered a hidden inscription on the last scroll. Nathaniel wanted to destroy the third passage. The guild is growing and gaining strength. Revenues have risen by 40%. But the king of Valdemar has officially summoned Dan to court. The guild refused. This means an inevitable conflict with the crown. The 8th month. Dan is sleeping in his room. 3 in the morning. The door opens silently. He wakes not from the sound, from the movement of air, a cold draft from the hallway. Dan opens his eyes. A shadow by the door, quick, low, the glint of metal in the moonlight streaming through the window. A knife. Dan rolls off the mattress. The knife strikes where his neck had been a second ago. It plunges into the straw. Dan screams. The shadow lunges at him. A second strike. Dan raises his arm. The blade slashes his forearm. Pain, hot, wet. The door bursts open. Brand. He's sleeping a floor below and heard the scream. Brand grabs the shadow by the collar, yanks it back. The shadow writhes. The knife strikes Brand in the shoulder. It goes in, up to the hilt. Brand doesn't let go. He smashes the attacker's forehead into his face. A crunch. The shadow goes limp. Brand throws the body to the floor. He presses his hand against the wound on his shoulder. The blood is flowing heavily, dark. Brand says he's fine, but his voice is quiet. Too quiet. Dan jumps up. He presses his hand against the wound on his forearm. He looks at the attacker. A man, around 30, plain clothes, an unfamiliar face, not from the guild. Brand sits against the wall. His face has gone pale. Dan sees the knife in his shoulder. The blade is dark, not from the blood, dark in and of itself, a coating. Dan smells it, bitter, slightly sweet. Poison. He screams, calls for Maggie, calls for anyone. Maggie runs in 2 minutes later, with a bag, with the very tools Dan made for her. She sees Brand, sees the knife, sees the dark blade. Her face freezes. She pulls the knife out in one swift motion. Brand clenches his teeth. He doesn't scream. Maggie washes the wound. She cauterizes it with something from the vial. Brand loses consciousness. Maggie says the poison is slow acting. It won't kill him right away. But if it isn't flushed from his blood within a day, a fever will set in. And the fever will kill him in 3 days. She knows this poison. Black vine root. Southern. They use it in the lands of the Order of the Flame. Dan sits on the floor of his room. Blood from the cut on his arm drips onto the stones. Brand lies unconscious. Because of him. Because he threw himself at the knife that was meant for Dan. Maggie works on Brand all night. Dan doesn't leave. He sits nearby. Ayla arrives at dawn. She sits down silently next to Dan. She doesn't ask how he is. She sees the cut on his arm. She takes a bandage. She bandages it. Her hands are cold, and they're trembling. Just a little, barely noticeable, but Dan can feel it. Brand comes to around noon. The fever sets in by evening. Maggie gives him a decoction. It's bitter. Brand drinks it and curses. He lies there in the fever for 3 days. Maggie doesn't leave his side. She changes the bandages. She gives him the decoction. Using fine needles from Dan's kit, she stitches the wound so the seam lies flat. No inflammation, no pus. The instruments work. Brand survives. On the 4th day, the fever breaks. Brand opens his eyes. The first thing he says, he asks if they caught the second one. Dan doesn't understand. Brand says there were two of them. He saw a shadow on the stairs as he ran upstairs. The shadow went downstairs. The second killer got away. Dan goes to Juan, tells him. Juan listens, coughs, then says the poison is from the Order's lands, that the attacker isn't local, that it was a hit. Someone wants Dan dead, not to ransom him, not to steal him, to kill him. Juan orders the guards doubled. 2 fighters stand guard at Dan's door around the clock. Dan returns to the forge. His hands are shaking. Not from the wound, from something else. He stands by the furnace, stares at the fire, and thinks that if the knife had struck Dan's throat instead of Brand's shoulder, everything he had built would have died with him. All the records, all the regulations, all the blueprints. Without him there to explain them, they'll become dead letters within a single generation, like Nathaniel's records, 200 years in the dust. He can't be the only one, not anymore. Halgrim approaches. He stands silently beside him. Dan speaks to him. He says that starting tomorrow, Halgrim will take full responsibility for the first forge. All the smelting, all the decisions, without Dan by his side. Halgrim is silent. Then he nods. Dan continues. Torin takes the second forge, the forging of simple items, knives and arrowheads for ordinary arrows, on his own. Lian continues to keep records and begins her training. Dan will teach her everything he knows. Not blacksmithing, theory, metallurgy, chemistry, physics, everything. So that if he's gone tomorrow, there will be at least one mind left in which the knowledge lives in its entirety. Halgrim says that's the right thing to do. Then he adds that a knife in the dark is a convincing teacher. Dan snorts. Brand recovers over 2 weeks. His shoulder heals. Maggie says the suture is perfect, that the new needles made the difference between life and death, that without them, the infection would have killed him before the poison did. Brand comes to the smithy in the 3rd week. His arm is bandaged, his face is gaunt, but his eyes are alive. He sits down on a bench. He says that while he was lying in the heat, he had the same dream over and over. A broken sword. That very one, the first one, the one that broke the day they found Dan in the snow. Brand says that in that dream, the sword was putting itself back together, piece by piece, as if time were running backward. And when it was whole again, Brand saw that it wasn't his old sword. It was a new one, made of Dan's steel. Brand falls silent. Then he says it's probably nonsense. Dan says no, it's not nonsense. 3 weeks pass while Dan recovers and reorganizes the smithy's operations. And during those 3 weeks, something happens that he didn't expect. The guild is running without him. Halgrim is smelting. Torin is forging. Lian is keeping the log. Isla is doing the math. The system is alive. Not perfectly. Halgrim overcooks one batch and loses the lot. Torin makes the pommels slightly heavier than standard. Lian mixes up the numbers of 2 blanks in the log. Mistakes. Normal human mistakes. But the system catches them. The log shows a deviation. The control sample identifies the defect. The next batch comes out right. Dan stands in the doorway of the forge. He watches Halgrim and Torin work, uncle and nephew, shoulder to shoulder by the furnace. Torin hands over a tool before Halgrim reaches out. Halgrim nods without looking up. They work as a single mechanism. Dan feels something warm rising in his chest. Not pride, something more. The school is growing. An attempt is made on Dan's life with a poisoned knife. Brand saves him, taking a blow to the shoulder. The poison from the lands of the Order of the Flame confirms that the order came from outside. Brand survived thanks to Maggie's surgical tools. Dan realized he couldn't remain the sole bearer of knowledge and handed over full responsibility for the forges to Halgrim and Torin. Lian began in-depth theoretical training. While Dan was recovering, the guild operated without him for the first time and managed just fine. The 9th month. The 10th. Dan teaches. Every day. From morning till night. Halgrim is no longer an apprentice. He is a partner. He conducts smelting runs on his own. He solves problems on his own. When another batch of ore arrives with a high sulfur content, Halgrim doesn't run to Dan. He increases the proportion of pyrolusite in the charge. On his own. By 5. Based on the logbook where all previous smelting runs with similar ore are recorded. He checks the results, makes adjustments, takes notes. Dan checks in the evening. Everything is correct. He says nothing. He just nods. Halgrim nods back. That's enough. Torin is growing faster than Dan expected. He has the hands of his grandfather and great-grandfather, 4 generations in his blood. But now his hands are joined by his mind. He understands why he strikes this way and not another, why the temperature is exactly this, why quenching is in oil and not in water. He has stopped doing things simply because that's how he was taught. He does them because he understands. That is the difference between a craftsman and an engineer. Torin is not yet an engineer, but he is no longer just a blacksmith. Lien knows the theory better than Torin. She doesn't stand at the forge, her hands aren't made for a hammer, but she can look at a fracture and tell what went wrong. She can recalculate the charge for new ore. She can draw a furnace blueprint from scratch. Dan is teaching her the iron-carbon phase diagram. He draws on the board. He explains. Austenite, ferrite, cementite, martensite. Lien listens. Then she asks a question that stumps Dan for a second. She asks if the color of the temper line can be used to determine not only the tempering temperature, but also the approximate carbon content in the steel. Dan thinks. Strictly speaking, no. The color of the temper line depends on the thickness of the oxide film, not on carbon. But in practice, under the same heating conditions, high-carbon steel produces a slightly different shade. The difference is minimal, but it's there. Lien noticed it from the log entries. She compared the temper colors with the results of the spark test and found a correlation. Dan looks at her. He says she just did what an entire quality control department used to do at his plant. Lien shrugs. She says she just read the log carefully. Halgrim walks by. He hears. He shoots Dan a look. That one. I told you so. Dangerous girl. The school. 12 people by the start of the 11th month. Halgrim, Torin, Lien, Oswald and Brynmore. 2 more apprentices whom Torin has started teaching himself. Without Dan. By the rules. By the log. By the system. 3 fighters whom Bran sent to learn the basics. They aren't blacksmiths, but they know how to judge a blade's quality by its spark and its ring. They can tell good steel from junk. They know how to sharpen at the right angle without ruining the temper by overheating it on the whetstone.